Well, what's going on, everyone? Wanted to jump on with a little bit of bonus content from our How Not to Read the Bible series. Stuff that didn't make the cut, didn't have time to talk about in the sermon this past week. So this past week we were in the section of the series that we're basing off of this book right here, How Not to Read the Bible by Dan Kimball. Good book. Pick it up if you haven't already, or listen to it or rent it or whatever that looks like. But we were in the section where we're kind of talking about the Old Testament law. We specifically focused on the issue of slavery and how that comes up in the Old Testament. What are we supposed to do with that? What are we supposed to make of those passages? And so we tracked it from the creation story and God's original intent to working with a fallen and corrupt humanity to what Jesus ultimately does and the trajectory that it launches us onto into our world currently, right? We didn't even scratch the surface, really, even on the slavery conversation. But one of the things that we didn't talk about at all is, what about the other Old Testament laws? What about some of this really weird stuff that we see? Like I said, time just didn't allow for that in the past week. But so what do you do when you come across these Old Testament laws? What do you do when you open up Leviticus and read things like, hey, you can't eat pork, or don't shave the hair on the sides of your head, or don't wear clothes with blended fabrics. Don't have a tattoo. I picked those four specifically because I have broken all of those in the past week. In fact, two of them I break pretty much every day because I have a tattoo and it doesn't go away. And I really like a good cotton poly blend shirt. I just do. So how are we supposed to understand that? Is that legit? If so, how do I take anything in the Bible seriously? Well, let's employ some of the tools that we've been learning in this series to address that and to give us some tools moving forward for when we come across those passages. So number one, remember the Bible is a library, not a book. Not one single kind of book, lots of different genres, lots of different people, written during different time periods. The second thing that we talk about is, hey, the Bible is written for us. There's wisdom, there's instruction, reveals stuff about humanity and the nature of the world. It reveals who God is, right? It's for us, but it's not written to us. It's written to different people groups at different times. So we got to do some interpretation of culture. We talk about, hey, we can't read any single verse in isolation. It fits somewhere in the context of a larger story. And then the final principle is ultimately the entire Bible points to Jesus. So let's talk about that with some of these Old Testament laws, some of these weird things. So it being a library and not just a book kind of ties into it's written for us, but not to us. Where we find these strange commands are in what we call the Old Testament law, and this is ancient Near Eastern law code. So laws that made sense in that time and place in the ancient Near East, what we would call just the Middle East today, but 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. And so it's a little bit strange to us. We don't have the context. We don't have the cultural understanding. And sometimes it's honestly hard to even get back that far in terms of culture to understand what is being said. So here's an example, right? In our modern world, our modern example, you can Google and look up some really, really strange laws that exist within the United States. And it's like, what the heck is that all about? In fact, in the book, How Not to Read the Bible, he gives a couple of examples that there's a law on the books I believe it's in Arizona, that you cannot let a donkey sleep in a bathtub, right? It's just not allowed. Another weird law is in Kentucky, you can't have an ice cream cone. You can't carry an ice cream cone in your back pocket. Now, there's debate whether or not the donkey in the bathtub law is legit or not. I couldn't come to a final conclusion on that in my very quick research. But if it is true, here's where it comes from. There was a farmer who had an old bathtub on his property, and his donkey would sleep in it. As that was happening, the donkey was sleeping in the bathtub. A reservoir broke, a dam broke somewhere nearby, and caused massive flooding. It lifted the donkey in the bathtub and floated the donkey away, and the bathtub ended up stuck in some sort of reservoir or basin. It took a lot of effort, a lot of resources, a lot of time to get the donkey unstuck. And so after that, they made a law, no donkeys in bathtubs. The Kentucky law about an ice cream cone in the back pocket, that one is legit. And that was to stop horse thieves. Okay? Horse thieves, right? What they would do is they would put an ice cream cone in their back pocket. Horses like the sweet things. And so they would just walk past the horse, and the horse would follow them wherever they wanted to go, wherever they wanted to take it to. And they'd be able to steal horses in that way. And so a law was passed, no ice cream in your back pocket. Okay? It's just not allowed. Now these laws seem crazy, right? To us. But at the time and in those places, it was like, oh yeah, it makes perfect sense. It was like in the first primary generation of when those laws were passed, people were like, oh yeah, I remember that happened. I read about it. I was there. I've seen the horse thievery problem in the ice cream bandits. Okay. And then the next generation is like, I kind of remember my parents talking about that. Or then the generation after that, oh yeah, that grandparents. And eventually you lose all context of why those laws ever existed. Those strange U.S. laws are about 100 to 200 years old. We're talking about the Old Testament law being 3,500 years old. Different world that they lived in. And we've got to keep that in mind, that it was written to a specific people at a specific time and place in the ancient Near East. And it made sense for them, which brings us then to the next principle, that we never read a verse on its own. That law, the ancient law, the Old Testament law, was written to the ancient Israelites, and it was written for a specific purpose. It was written primarily for the purpose to set Israel apart from the different peoples around them. Israel had come out of slavery in Egypt for 400 years, where the Egyptian people would have worshipped many different gods. As Israel came out and traveled to the Promised Land, and then in their time in the Promised Land, their neighbors in the other peoples that they encountered worshipped many different gods. And many of them had some practices of worship that were absolutely evil and atrocious, just degrading sexual rights, families involved in prostitution, child sacrifice to the different deities that these peoples worshipped. And so one of the primary things that God is doing through the Old Testament law is saying, hey, Israel, you're my people. You're not going to be like all of the peoples around you. You're going to be different. You are going to be set apart, or sometimes it's said you will be holy. Holy means to be set apart, to be different, to be other. And so God's like, you're my people. I need you to be different than all the people around you. And those laws did that in that time and in that context. And the reason that they were to be different or set apart was because God's presence was going to be there in the temple. And so that was going to be his dwelling place. And also, God was going to use the nation of Israel to bring about the Messiah, to bring about the Savior of the entire world. And so he's setting them apart for a purpose, for a specific purpose, which ultimately that purpose finds its fulfillment in Jesus. Now we're on to principle 4 of how to not to read the Bible, how to actually understand it. And that's the whole thing is about Jesus, that the law, or what we would call the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, that's an arrangement between God and ancient Israel. It was for a specific people at a specific time, at a specific place, and ultimately for a specific purpose to lead to the Messiah, to the Savior. That Old Covenant, it's not ours. It's not binding on me and you today. Now, that doesn't mean it's not important, and it doesn't mean that Jesus comes and hates on the law. In fact, when given the opportunity to talk about the law, Jesus said, hey, I didn't come to abolish it. I didn't come to get rid of it or speak down on it or say it doesn't matter, it's not important, or we can just throw it away. He says, no, I came to fulfill it. That the thing that the law was ultimately pointing to and leading to was me. And so Jesus begins then this new covenant that is based on who he is and what he's done, his life, death, and resurrection. And in that new covenant, when it comes to the law and how we are to live, Jesus was actually pressed on this topic on occasion. He was asked, what's the most important law? And he said, here's the most important law. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind. Some places add all your strength. Basically, love God with everything that you have. And you can't separate the two. They go together, love God and love your neighbor as yourself. He even says then that all of the Old Testament law, all the law and the prophets hang on those two commands, that they're all downstream of those two commands. They all flow out of those two commands. They're all pointing to those two commands, to love God and to love our neighbor as ourselves. So the question then becomes for us, if you're a follower of Jesus, trying to live out your faith, how do we faithfully love God and love others today? It's not by opening up the Old Testament law and saying, I'm going to follow this because things are going to get real weird real quick. What does it look like for us to love God and love neighbor? How do we know what that means? Do we just get to make that up on our own? Do we get to go, well, I think this is what love looks like, and I think this is what I should do over here? No, we can't make it up on our own. We'll all end up with different definitions. Here's how we know what it looks like to love God and love our neighbor. Number one, we read the New Testament. We read the Gospels, about the life of Jesus. What does his life, his teachings, his example, his death, his resurrection, what do those things tell us? What do they teach us? And then moving on from there, we have these letters from the apostles, those who were eyewitnesses, those who were there with Jesus. What do they tell us about how to follow Jesus, because that's what they're doing in the first century. They're looking at the life, the death, the resurrection of Jesus and saying, all right, now how do we live now in response to that? So we read and understand that. We look at the New Testament to figure out, what does it look like to love God, to love neighbor? And then the Old Testament, it actually gives us so much insight and context into that. It gives meaning and significance around some of these things. It fills in some of the details, because in the New Testament, we see that there are certain laws from the Old that no longer apply. They're just done away with. But we also see that some are tweaked or some are carried forward. So let me end our time with this quote from the book then. It's a little lengthy, so bear with me. But we read this. Dan Kimball, the author, writes that while many of the Old Testament laws are no longer valid today, some remain valid. In particular, the laws regarding moral behavior detailing how we treat others, including what God says about murder and sexual ethics. When he spoke about murder, Jesus didn't say he was throwing out the old. He pushes us to consider God's intent in the law, to look at how murder begins with hatred in the heart prior to the action. When Jesus is asked about divorce and marriage, he does not adopt contemporary Roman and Greek ethics of the time, but looks back to God's intention in the original creation in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. When asked about dietary laws or how to obey the Sabbath, we see Jesus giving new teaching. Jesus says the purpose of the Sabbath goes beyond the ritual observance of the day. He teaches that dietary restrictions are no longer needed since all foods are now declared clean, and the distinctions between ethnic groups belonging to God's people are coming to an end. To know which laws still apply to us and which ones don't, we need to look at what Jesus and the writers of the New Testament say continued and understand why they said it. Only then are we prepared to decide which laws do not need to be continued. In general, laws regarding the ordering of the Israelite nation, civil laws regarding temple sacrifice and worship, ceremonial laws, and dietary restrictions, some holiness laws, are no longer needed now that Jesus has come. In our Bible, we have the amazing privilege of seeing how God has revealed himself through time to different people in different places. And we can use what God has revealed in the past to better follow Jesus today. The New Testament and Jesus' teaching help us to know what it looks like to love and worship God and our neighbors as ourselves. So, hopefully that was at least somewhat helpful and gives you some handlebars and some tools to understand or to interpret these strange laws and commands when you come to them in the Old Testament. Again, if it's still confusing, if there's stuff that you don't get, that's all right. Like reading and understanding the Bible, it is a process. It is a lifelong journey, but it's one that we do not have to go at alone. We have the scriptures, we have God's Spirit living, working within us to guide us, and we also have each other. We have the church to go to ask questions, to share our faith with each other. So I hope you will lean into those things. And I hope to see you as we continue this series, How Not to Read the Bible, this coming Sunday and for the next couple of weeks. See you, everybody.